a not very productive day in isolation. It's the Easter weekend and I've been taking relaxing so seriously that I've been unable to do anything else. But hopefully my friend John is going to salvage some of this for me. John works as a rare book dealer in London, and he's agreed to talk to me about rare books and how to deal them. Thanks very much, John.
Thanks for having me.
What defines a rare book? At what point does a book become interesting to collectors? Is it solely based on the absolute number of copies, or is there more to it than that?
The simplest definition is one where the number of copies of the books is much lower than the number of collectors who want them. So you need both demand and scarcity. A good example of that is the Harry Potter series. The very first book, they only ever printed 500 hardback copies. That's now a £100,000 book. By the time you get to the seventh book, they printed 7 million copies of the first edition. So everyone's got the first edition of it, whether they are interested in first editions or not. It's valueless as a first edition because anyone can get one instantly. If, for example, J.K. Rowling has said we're only ever going to print 10 copies of book number 7, that would be like £1 million book now, obviously. So you need high demand and low supply, but you also need the demand to be strong enough that people will pay a fair amount of money, which is why I see it as something that as expensive books. So that's the most vulnerable way you can look at it.
So rare refers more to the not being enough supply to fill the demand rather than an absolute number of copies.
Yeah, exactly. So say you wrote a poem, there'd only be one poem in the whole world of that, right? So it would be absolutely, in objective terms, an incredibly rare item, but no one would want it, no offense. So it wouldn't be an object that had any value. Say James Joyce wrote one poem, there was only one copy in the whole world, it would be an incredibly expensive thing. So actually a lot of rare books, and especially things like ephemera, are objectively very rare. There might only be like 3 examples of that 1950s bus timetable in the whole world. But if no one cares, it's not going to be a valuable thing. So you need the people to care. If people care enough, even if it's moderately common, it can still be quite valuable. Someone like Winston Churchill, for example, signed a lot of books. Whenever someone asked him to sign a book, he'd sign it. There are thousands of genuine signatures out there, but it's still an incredibly expensive thing because so many people want it. But you must always put demand first. The thing you don't want to do is just think, oh, there aren't very many copies of this book, it must be valuable. That's why we have every day people come in and they'll have this random book and they'll say, but I couldn't find any other copies online, there's no copies in libraries. If people don't care, it's not going to be valuable. It's demand you need to put first before scarcity.
I think when a lot of people think of rare books, they see sort of old, musty books in the library. Does age have anything to do with it?
For all intents and purposes, age is completely irrelevant. The only exception is if you're going super old. So if you have any kind of medieval handwriting, that's valuable. Books printed pre-1500, so the very first 50 years of printing, they have this term called incunabula, which means from the cradle of printing. Those are collected just because they're old. They're collected because they come from that 50-year period, which is semi-arbitrary. In America, there's value in having an old book that was printed at an early point in a state's development. So you can get the first book printed in Hawaii, the first book printed in Alaska, or you can have the early American imprints from the 17th or 18th century in New England. They're valuable because they're old relative to when things came in. But just because a book's old, in general, it doesn't mean anything. The famous example is Bibles, where almost everyone has a really old Bible and everyone thinks it's worth a lot of money. People have this idea that in the past, books were incredibly rare and expensive and no one could read and only the elite could read and so on. That's true in the medieval period, and it's even true in the early years of printing, but eventually you get to a point around about the 17th century in England, and definitely by the 18th century, where the majority of men could read. It's low among women, obviously, but you still had that point where literacy was actually very wide in society, and of those people who could read, every single person had a copy of the Bible. There was always a market of several million people in the country who would want a Bible, and they couldn't sell them all a Bible every year. Most people would only buy one in their lifetime. But that's still enough of a market to produce at least several 100,000 Bibles, I would say, would have been printed in every year from 1700 onwards. And that's even ignoring eventually when you get to the point where you're also exporting Bibles all around the world. in general, the Bible is the least valuable book because there are just so many of them. There's a lot of families who will have the family Bible, and sometimes they'll come into us and say, well, we're in a position now where we have to sell it, and we have to tell them, sorry, it's worthless. Unfortunately, not always the easiest thing to tell them. But yeah, I mean, you can get 17th century books for £10, you can get 18th century books for a few pounds. Often a book 200 years old is going to be cheaper than a new book from Waterstones, which is crazy. But there's so many of them out there. They printed millions and millions of books every year in this country for the last few hundred years, and a lot of them are lost to time, but a lot aren't. So yeah, no, ages. That's the big misconception, is that something is valuable because it's old. Not the case.
How about condition and also the editions? Because you mentioned first edition Harry Potter books, for example. Is there any particular reason why people care about first editions as opposed to second or other?
So this is actually quite interesting because there's no objective reason you'd prefer the first edition. There are even objective reasons you wouldn't prefer the first edition, because often they have errors which are then corrected for the second edition. So often the second edition of a later edition is a superior text from a textual point. In that case, the first edition is less desirable. It's all basically, you need to believe in it. So you need to believe the first edition is something of value. So it's almost like conceptual art. You have to look at your first edition Harry Potter, which is almost identical in every single respect to any other copy, other than a few distinguishing points, and believe it's worth £100,000. And if you lose that sense of belief, it's a bit like the emperor having no clothes, when everyone will laugh at your loss of a stone that you paid £100,000 for. The reason I would defend the first edition of being of value is it allows you to imagine you are the author going in on the very first day that book is out and holding that book. And it's the first time that the author will see their book in its finished form. It's the first time the book will start to have an appearance on the world. And it's the earliest form the book will be read and interacted with. You'll remember from your studies of antiquity, Plato's idea that you have this ideal sense and everything else is just a manifestation. There's this idea that the first edition is the book in its most ideal, pure form, and every subsequent printing is slowly diminishing away from that perfect sense. And so getting the first edition is you having the book in its most perfect form that you could have it. If someone actually asked me, why should I buy a first edition? That's why I would defend a first edition being valuable. Luckily, that job is mostly done for us. This idea that the first edition is valuable is very ingrained in society, to the extent that it's quite rare that someone actually says to me, well, hang on, why is this?
Everybody's convinced about it.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's convinced about it, to the extent that that's why someone will see that they've got a first edition of the later Harry Potter books and they think, oh, great, it's worth a lot, because first edition is worth a lot. Obviously, as explained earlier, they'll have printed so many that they wouldn't be.
Where did this interest actually start? Does book dealing come out of a general kind of antiquarian tradition for books among other items and split off, or does it have different roots?
So in history, people always turn to books as status symbols. So it was very common for an aristocrat to have their library, which they spend a lot of money having bound in really fine bindings and so on. They'd then go for these most luxurious editions. So there would be a market for producing really top quality books, finely illustrated, finely printed, finely bound for these libraries. So there was always a market for what you might call special, deluxe, fancy books. It was round about the 18th century where what you'd call the first edition market appeared. And at that point, it wasn't modern first editions at all. They wanted to collect the very first appearance in print of the Greek and Roman writers. So you'd want your first edition of Thucydides, your first edition of Herodotus, whatever. That was then the start of what would eventually morph into the literature first edition market. So the idea at that point that you'd buy the first edition of a recent poem would be crazy. Like, they wouldn't care about that at all, but they wanted their first edition of, one of these Greek or Roman writers. That then morphed into not super modern, but going a bit more contemporary. So then they started wanting their first edition of Shakespeare and Chaucer and whatever. And then eventually, over the 19th century, the point at which they collected just became closer and closer and closer to the present, until suddenly by the end of the 19th century, people are collecting even like living authors. So that's kind of a brief overview of how it started. It used to be wealthy men wanting really elaborate deluxe books, but they'd more go for books that were hot off the press. Then it became them wanting to add to that the first printings of Greek and Roman writers, and then it started they want their Shakespeare, and then it ended up all the way up to the first editions. In terms of why people are still attracted to it today and why dealers enter the trade, I mean, there's as many stories as there are people. For whatever reason, they all somehow get this reaction from books that they find very compelling, books as objects as opposed to literature. For me, I've always just liked old things, and I found books the most accessible way of buying old things. I mean, it's quite hard to buy old art unless you have a lot of money, and then you might only be able to get a few pictures. Furniture, again, you might end up with a few chairs, but like how much furniture can you get in like a room? So initially I started at university because I realized that buying, say I wanted a copy of Tennyson or whatever, it was cheaper to buy one from 1850 than it was to go to Waterstones and buy one. But I ended up just buying all these old books, just partly because they were old, partly to read, but also partly because they were old. And then it just kind of gets more and more out of hand. Because at least at that point, I kind of fetishized age, and I just thought something being old is in itself interesting, which to an extent I still think, but not as much as I used to. You go further and further back into time, you start discovering little avenues and so on. You start appreciating things you didn't appreciate initially. I just spent lots of money buying a lot of books, as opposed to spending a lot of money on a few books, which is probably a better way to approach collecting. There are people who actually object to the whole dealing of books, like making lots of money, selling off one-of-a-kind manuscripts and so on. There are people who don't like the idea that it's all monetized and commercialized and things can disappear into private collections. I quite like it because I think society values things that have a high monetary value, and by giving something a high monetary value, it's going to be preserved. So actually, as far as I'm concerned, the more expensive, the better, really. It's a bit of a shame when collectors are deterred from buying because everything's so expensive, but I still quite like the idea that we as a society do value these objects.
And you mentioned that you valued them as old objects, but what specific characteristics draw people to old books? Do people like if they have, for example, a nice binding or a particular kind of print, or maybe if they come from certain publishers, or if they have annotations? What are the things that people look out for?
Well, you just named four. There's as many different avenues you could approach as there are people. In general, you start with you want a first edition of a famous text. That's most people's entry point. Then it's condition. So you want it in its original binding. You absolutely, and this is a one universal law, so you want it complete. So you don't want any plates to be removed. You don't want any pages to be removed. Ideally, you want it unrestored. Some people aren't so bothered if it's been repaired, but some people won't touch a repaired book at all. Yeah, so you want the book looking like it looked on the day it was published or shortly after it was first bound, with as little of times touching as possible. Depending on whether you're in the antiquarian or modern market, you might like or dislike annotation. So in general now, people who collect books pre-1800s, they quite like contemporary annotations. They didn't used to. If they had a book in contemporary annotations, they'd go to a binder who'd take out all the annotations.
What counts as contemporary?
So normally, ideally, the century the book was published, if you're getting to about 1500, then you can have another couple of centuries on top of that. But if it was a book from the 1700s, really, it has to be from that century. And then if it's the next century, you might get away with pretending it's near contemporary. Basically, you don't want 20th century annotations in a 16th century book, at least at this point. I mean, people might find it interesting one day. But yeah, the market's changed for old books, and now people quite like exploring how people first read them. Not the case with the modern first edition market, where it's still entirely, you don't want anyone to have touched this book. You want it looking absolutely pristine. You don't want someone to have written their name in. Definitely you don't want them to have annotated it or turned the page corners down or drawn a little picture, which in itself might change. I mean, in another 100 years, people might be interested in how people first interacted with Harry Potter through their annotations or so on. But at least for now, you don't want them to have touched it. Yeah, so that's the main thing. Okay, so the two overriding things are edition and condition. Beyond that, then there are 100 avenues. As you said, you can collect a single publisher, a single author. You could collect it for the plates, for the binding. It could be very much about that one book as object. What does a single book tell us about this? Or you could collect it in the aim of collecting all 50 books published by this press over its whole publication history or whatever. As a dealer, you hear like the most niche things. People say, oh, I collect books on coinage printed in Europe from 1750 to 1770. And then I'll say, well, I've got one printed in Britain from 1770, and they'll just turn their nose up to it and think, no, that's not for me. So some people are incredibly niche. But at its most broad level, if someone was starting collecting books and had money, I'd say, what are your favorite books? And they'll say some. And I will hopefully be able to then, first thing I'll bring out will be a first edition of it if I can. And that's your starting point normally.
We've been talking about books and printed editions. And yesterday in our pub quiz, it came up that the first book was printed in 1455 in Mainz, Gutenberg Press. Yep. Okay. Does it go back further than this, handwritten manuscripts? Does that also count in the rare book dealing trade?
Yep.
And what's the geographical scope as well? Like, are we interested in things that come out of medieval China? Does it extend to other parts of the world?
So as a good rule of thumb, if you want to be a rare book dealer, is stick to what you know. So say if you know medieval China, by all means enter the market. What you don't want, and is often ends up being slightly embarrassing, is when a dealer attempts to enter a market they don't understand. So the dealer should always restrict themselves to things that they can claim at least a certain level of expertise about. You don't really ever want to be in a position where the customer clearly knows more about your stock than you do. Which sometimes happens anyway. So they have a really niche interest and you have a book that fulfills that niche, they'll know a lot more than you will. So there are in general pretty much any avenue of collecting you can think of, there will be a dealer somewhere who's doing it. But it's not the case you'll be able to walk into any rare bookshop and say, I want books on medieval China, because they will not be touching that material unless they had a Chinese speaking person who was an expert in it.
Could these be in the form of manuscripts, for example, or scrolls? Yeah. Do people look at papyrus? What's the range of stuff that you come across?
Yeah, so manuscripts count. Anything in book shape is called a codex, as you'll know. So anything in codex shape counts as a book anyway. Rare book dealers, if they want to sell something, they'll manage to work it into being a book. They'll count scrolls, they'll count, letters, they'll count whatever. Some of them openly put their business as rare books and manuscripts, or rare books and letters and whatever. So they do include that. In general, though, if they feel they could sell it, they'll just count it under a rare book. Certain things you mentioned, like there's very little, at least entire Greek or Roman papyrus scrolls on the market. You might have like a fragment, like we've got a fragment in stock, which is like 3 centimeters squared maybe. But you're not going to make a whole business selling Roman scrolls.
As an archaeologist, this has just made me think of, what do you do if you do get something very old or slightly suspicious for some other reason that you think might have been appropriated in a way that it shouldn't have been? For example, some archaeologist putting it on eBay instead of logging it among the...
Well, it's a very tricky question, actually. It's not so much a problem of archaeologists, at least in our business. I mean, it would be more for coins or whatever. The big problem for us was something stolen from a library. Firstly, that's why actually we do due diligence as far as we can. So we really try and trace where has it come from. But you do sometimes get the case where a collector will die, his widow will be selling the collection and will have no idea where any of it came from. And then you might find, for example, you might have a book where it's quite clear that library markings within the book have been removed. Now, you don't then know, was it the library entirely legally deaccessioning the book, which then the collector thought, I don't want these library marks and take them out, or was it stolen and so on? So you need as much diligence as you can have, but it's often not possible to completely trace the provenance of every single book. The main thing is always be skeptical. And remember, your reputation is depending on it, and do all you reasonably can to prevent any kind of book that might be stolen or whatever coming into your stock.
I see. To go back to the train of thought that I was following before, are there any overarching developments in the way that European books have been printed since the Gutenberg Press, since the 15th century? Is there a clear trajectory, or is it not particularly coherent?
No, it's very coherent. So actually, this is one of the ways that if you want to start learning about rare books, which obviously you do, technological change was incredibly slow all the way up to the Industrial Revolution. The basic format of Gutenberg's press in 1450 was exactly the same, or mostly the same, in 1800. I mean, there will be little differences in design that a scholar will pick me up on there, but in essence, it's the same principle. So actually, once you learn the basic way books are printed and bound, that knowledge then is equally applicable to a book from 1500, 1600, 1700, whatever. So actually, the pace of change at that point was very slow. And then with the Industrial Revolution, where books went from being all operated from a single hand press, each page being made by someone pulling the lever, sticking the page down on the type, it then became industrialized, and then the pace of developments in printing technology changed quite quickly. So after that, things become much more complicated. And to the extent that, I mean, I probably shouldn't admit this, but the way books are printed now, I'm not sure. I mean, I imagine it's all like computers and laser jet printers and so on. The pace of change is now so quick that it's hard to really pay attention. And but otherwise, Gutenberg kind of nailed it. He worked it all out in such a way that actually you didn't really need to change anything for the next 300-400 years, which is good because it means you can grasp it and comprehend it, and you don't need to learn a new printing style every 20 years from 1450 to now. Book history is, at least in terms of how they're printed, is all linear until the Industrial Revolution. Then there's a few things to get your head around, which then continues until the age of computers, and then I don't understand after the age of computers how they're made. Probably should. Linear development punctuated by major technological advances.
I see. You mentioned that you see a lot of Harry Potter first editions. There must have been a lot of, did you say 500 of them printed?
Of the very first book, they did 500 hardback, 5,000 paperback.
I see. Are there any other books that you come across very frequently as rare books, the ones that particularly stand out? Like first edition of Lord of the Rings, of Fellowship.
Oh, yeah, okay. So pretty much every famous 20th century author's most famous book will be something that we are asked for a lot. So we'll always try and have a copy of first edition 1984, first edition, whatever, Kafka's Metamorphosis, for example. Certain authors are just very widely collected. So Ian Fleming, for example, the James Bond series is a bit of a mainstay for us. We just endlessly buy and sell copies. Winston Churchill was very popular.
Does the supply of these books match up to the demand?
Well, so that's actually quite interesting. So if you take Ian Fleming, for example, as he became more and more famous, as with Harry Potter, they started printing more and more. To the extent that actually, in terms of absolute scarcity, they're not that scarce. They printed, tens of thousands of copies of the later ones. But because these were books that people actually read and took with them on the train and took to the beach and whatever, the condition is generally quite bad. So when we operate in that market for, say, the later James Bond books, we're not actually operating in a sense that we're going to get you something that's really rare and really hard to get. What we're then doing is we're operating on the condition side, where we're giving you a really good condition book. So it's actually the condition that is the rarity, not the actual number of surviving copies, which means people will ring up and say, hang on, you're asking X amount for a book and it's here for like £10. And then you look at the £10 copy and it doesn't have a dust jacket. It's got like a coffee stain on it. Because these books, they don't really have time to have been lost to time. Something like first edition of Shakespeare, hundreds of copies will now have vanished off the face of the earth, but that's not really going to be the case for a book published 30, 40 years ago.
Okay, and on that note, actually, what are the most expensive rare books that you come across, and how much do people pay for them?
Name someone you're interested in, I'll tell you.
How about somebody like Dickens, like a first edition of Tale of Two Cities? That was one of the most widely bought books, I believe, when it came out.
Yeah, so actually with Dickens, it's the same thing, that as he became more and more famous, and Tale of Two Cities was quite a late book in his work, they were actually printing a lot. So again, it's more down to condition. Hang on, I'll return back to the other point in a bit, but then I will first do Dickens. The way Dickens was published is they issued it in parts, so like paperback parts of say 40 pages at a time over 10 months. And then after that was done, they then brought it out as a book. So actually what Dickens collectors ideally want is they want a set in the original parts, which were mostly chucked away after people read them. It's like you wouldn't keep a newspaper or whatever, so there aren't that many parts surviving. So what you then want is a full set of the parts in really good condition. So that's Dickens. But that was the size up. Tale of Two Cities, it's about £2,000 to £3,000 for a nice copy, so it's not too expensive.
Not so much.
But the print run was quite big. And Dickens, no, Dickens is popular, but he's fading slightly. So actually, this is why I almost feel books are quite cheap, because even the absolute mega hitters are still only just about £200,000. And I know you're thinking £200,000 is a lot of money, but actually, if you compare that to, say, the modern art market, £200,000 in the modern art market would get you very little. Whereas £200,000 in the rare book market, well, it will either get you the very, very best in if you want a single book, or it will be enough to build an entire amazing collection. The real heavy hitters in books is Darwin's Origin of Species, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, Newton's Principia Mathematica. So they're all about £200,000 a copy, for a nice copy. But that is pretty much the highest level you'll pay. Other than Shakespeare will set you back a lot more than that.
Is it because they had some sort of tangible impact on society, as well as the fact that they're very famous?
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a school of collecting which is popular among the super rich, which is collecting the major titles in Western thought. So as opposed to literature, although they might collect literature separately, they're not actually so interested in how a book has affected them. So say someone buys Harry Potter, it's normally because they really like Harry Potter. If they're buying, for example, Darwin's Origin of Species, it's very probable they haven't actually read Darwin's Origin of Species. They're buying it as a symbol of what the book represented when it first came out. And same for Newton's Principia, same for Wealth of Nations. Karl Marx's Das Kapital is a 100-gram book if you want it, which is ironic in some ways. But you're collecting the major stepping stones, at least in Western history, which I quite like, because I feel it kind of proves that the history of Europe is the history of its books, and you can mostly trace every major change after the printing press to a single book that was published and so on. And then also, it gives you the status. Like if you can say, I've got a first edition Origin of Species, that's something to talk about at dinner parties. Like, say you bought James Joyce's Ulysses, which is also £250,000 book in its absolutely flawless state in its first edition. There is always a chance someone at the dinner party will say, yeah, I don't really like James Joyce, and then there might be an argument about whether he's a good author. If you buy Origin of Species, you're not going to be like, yeah, I don't really like Darwin. It's more that it's got such an obvious, tangible effect on the course of human history that it's kind of indisputably a good book. In the 1980s, they had this absolutely amazing book auction where someone had put together a £30 million book collection, which was then auctioned off, and it raised £30 million, and it was like an absolutely incredible book collection. And we've never since, this was late 80s, we've never since had a sale that succeeded that. But then what someone's pointed out is about 2 days after that book auction that made 30 million quid, someone spent more than 30 million on a painting by a living artist. So a painting by a living artist exceeded in the value this collection, which is pretty much indisputably the greatest collection of any private collector who was then living. So that's it. So you could build literally the best book collection in the world for less than buying a single painting by a living artist who could just, paint another one.
That comparative value is quite sad to me.
Depressing. Yeah, it's sad to me. But I sometimes some of our customers also deal in modern art. I don't like modern art, except my banners. But some of them deal in modern art, and like they will spend very large sums of money on a painting that was made a couple of years ago by an artist who, for all you know, won't last 10 years in being deemed an important artist. Whereas if you spend the same amount on an Origin of Species, no one's ever going to say, yeah, actually evolution didn't affect the course of human history that much. But it's not going to happen. Their place is cemented. So that's why I actually think, despite the fact I'm dealing in, often very large numbers being thrown around by me, I still think that fundamentally books are cheap for what you are and what you get out of them.
Are there any books that are considered priceless?
No. The most expensive thing that could be counted as a book ever sold was they sold Leonardo da Vinci's notebook to Bill Gates for $30 million. Was
that in the 1950s?
It wasn't in the 80s. Yeah, that was separate to that book sale, but the book sale was a whole collection. That was just a single item. The most expensive printed book is something called the Bay Psalm book, which was the first book printed in what would then become the United States. That went for, I think, 18 million. So those are your two most expensive books. There's quite a famous book called Audubon's Birds of America, which is a life-sized color print of every single American bird. That goes often for about 5 to 10 million, but you can kind of see it more as like a big portfolio of original art, which is why I sometimes don't really want to class it as a book. And then the other big one, as mentioned earlier, is Shakespeare. The first printing of Shakespeare will probably set you back about 5 million now. Sometimes you do have the problem where most countries have some kind of rule that if you sell something and the state deems it something they should have, they can take it. But in most countries, that means that if they take it, they then have to pay you. Say you bought, a Napoleon manuscript in France for £1 million, the French government might say, no, that's ours, but they would then have to pay you. So in that sense, it still wouldn't be priceless.
Did that happen recently with Cuthbert's Bible in the UK?
I think it may have happened. You're testing my memory, but I think it may have happened. It doesn't actually worry us too much as a dealer because, at least for us in Britain, they almost never step in. If they had something like, say they found the original Shakespeare manuscript or whatever, the British government would stop it. For Lady Chatterley's Lover, I think they had the copy the judge annotated when he decided whether to keep the book banned or not. I think they may have done an export license ban on that. It's harder in some countries like Italy. The government's a lot more gung-ho about stopping export. France is the same. Britain's much more lenient, and America's even more so. America never stops anything being sold. But no, there's no priceless books. If you can sell it, you can.
Doomsday Book? Linda's Farm Gospels?
Well, this is a problem that they're all now locked away.
That's the only thing that's preventing you.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I mean, things. Okay, so those are one of a kind things. But you've got medieval manuscripts that will come up at auction. You have very early documents, one of a kind manuscripts, and famous authors. I mean, they all come up at auction. So no, nothing's really priceless. Everything has a price. It's kind of a stupid word.
Okay. Are there any central authorities that you refer to, or central databases, or any kind of centralization of knowledge on rare books?
There's not like a central thing. There are various authorities we turn to, which differs for each book. So for most famous authors, someone will have written an authoritative bibliography where they will have compared every single copy they could find to prove which is the real first edition. So for most famous authors, you've got your reference guide, which you can take out. You go to the right page, it will tell you what to look for the first edition, and then if it matches, you can put in your description the reference book and page number, which is proof that you've checked it, that it matches, and then also allows the customer to check themselves and make sure it all matches up. And there's various other things you can use. So there is, for example, a central database of auction price records. So one of the first things we do if we have a book we're not sure about, we'll see what has it made at auction. And sometimes you think, oh, it's a really great book. You look at the auction records and it's made like 20 quid, no one cares. Other times you think, it's a really boring book. You look at the auction records and then suddenly it's been going for thousands of pounds a time. There's also interlibrary catalogues where you can search all the library holdings at once and it will tell you there are this many copies of the book in libraries all around the world. What there isn't like a single body that completely enforces all the trade rules. So there's an organisation that represents all the British dealers, and there's another organisation that does that internationally, which sets codes of conduct for people to follow and so on. But it's not like you turn to them if you are unsure about a book. They're more setting the ground rule, setting the rules that you have to play by.
Fair enough. Okay, and as an individual, if I suspect that I have a rare book, how do I go about it?
You don't.
You don't know.
That's my that's my joke. If you think you have a rare book, you don't. In extremely rare cases, someone will just find out they have a rare book. In general, it doesn't happen. All the rare books are in known collections. They will have been bought by someone who knows what they are, what their value is. sometimes, they'll have a book which would be interesting. So you might find out you have a first edition of Dickens and whatever, but then we get back to, it's not just that you need the first edition, you need the first edition, the original binding in really good conditions. So people do say, oh, look, I just happen to have this first edition of Dickens, but it's very unlikely they'll also then have it in collectible condition or so. So that was just me being mean and saying you don't have a rare book. If you want to find out, the good thing about the internet, and this is what's really changed it, there are central websites, not too dissimilar to Amazon, who bring together the inventories of all the different book dealers in the world. So what you can do is search the book you have, and it will tell you this many copies online, and dealers are asking this much money. And in most cases where you do that with a book that you think is valuable, it will tell you actually it's not so valuable. Sometimes it will give you false hope. Like there's some dealers who will just put an incredibly high price on every single book they have and hope that someone somewhere will be stupid enough to buy it. So sometimes there are these kind of fake prices out there. So you think, oh great, this book's worth £1,000, but it's not. It's just a non-dealer trying their luck. I mean, that's the other thing with the internet is if you're actually having a proper bookshop, that you pay rent on and so on, you need to do things properly. But now anyone can just set up a rare book business from their spare room if they wanted to. And there's a lot of complete rubbish online being touted as valuable first editions, so you need to be careful. But you can at least see what else is out there, what a dealer's charging. And yeah, I mean, the whole trade is now much more open and transparent than it used to be. So you'd see a rare book you wanted at a book fair, and you didn't know whether you'd ever see one again in your whole life or whether you'd see one next week. Whereas now you get your phone out, and you might see, actually, there's 8 copies I could buy. This one is actually cheaper, so I'll buy it. Or no, this guy is 4 times more expensive than everyone else. So it's massively opened up a way for an individual to find out the value of their book, at least in the sense of what are other dealers asking, which isn't always the best way of finding out, but it, or at least giving you a proper figure, but at least gives you an idea.
Would you recommend keeping hold of or buying, in fact, any first editions of books that seem like they're becoming popular?
No. I would say under 1% of books published will ever become valuable as a first edition. The overwhelming majority, it's like when you buy a car, it loses half its value as soon as you drive out to the dealer. The vast majority of books you spend £10 on as a new copy or £20 for some big first edition hardbacks are never going to bring you that kind of money back. So I've heard stories of people who buy every new book that comes out and lay it down like a fine wine and hope it increases in value. If you think each new book is costing you 10, 20 quid, you buy 100 new books, you spend £1,000. And it's very rare that any book will ever exceed £1,000 of value. So yeah, I mean, you could try. I mean, there are people who do it. You can narrow it down a bit more. So some people, for example, they'll buy the books of a Pulitzer Prize winner in the hope that they'll then go on to greater things and the books will, become more valuable. So there are kind of ways you can try and second guess the market. But no, in general, the modern first edition market is a small number of authors. They're early titles in good condition, and there's no point buying a first edition of, well, even a popular author, because the print run will be so big. So there's no point buying a first edition of the new Stephen King novel because they're going to print 5 million or whatever. But yeah, most authors will fade away and be completely forgotten, unfortunately. And it's unlikely you'll ever get your money back.
Oh, I don't think I want to end on that note, so I'll ask another one actually. Do you think that people who have the rare books in their collections read them?
You don't read your rare books. It'd be like eating off your fine china. You've got your copy. So if you're buying a first edition of Ulysses, you've got your paperback copy in which you've read it. You really like the book and you want to have perfect example of the book, as you said earlier. So you want your first edition, it's then your status symbol, you can look at it, you can admire it, it can make you happy, whatever. The worst thing you could do is read it, because you're then damaging the condition and lowering its value. So you don't buy, this is the thing, as we said earlier, that actually a first edition book is not objectively more valuable in that the text is the same. So the text of the book will be exactly the same as any other copy. So if you want to read it, you will still read your original copy in most cases. There are certain collectors who do read their first editions, just kind of, I've paid for this and I'm going to enjoy it. If you're collecting something like early books that were never reprinted, then you might read them because there's no other way to read them. But in general, no, these are not books that we're selling to read. If you want to read a book, you can go to Waterstones to get it. These are books as objects. But if your other question, which you were kind of implying, was, do collectors really care about it? And that's something I'm asked a lot, especially when you go down the road of hedge fund men spending a large sum of money building their really fancy library. Some people say, well, do they even really care? Do they really appreciate it? Or is it just them flaunting their wealth? In general, from what I've seen meeting customers, is that they do appreciate what they're buying. They don't necessarily understand it. So you might try and explain to them, oh, this is how the book was bound, this is the history of the book, whatever, and you see their eyes glaze over. But in general, they appreciate what they're getting. It's kind of like, imagine you were buying a Bentley. You don't necessarily need to understand exactly how carburetors work and how the engine works, whatever. You can just admire it as a Bentley. It's the same with people who buy rare books, who come from a position of wealth and wanting their fancy library. They often don't really understand anything about the books, but they still do appreciate it and do value it. So yeah, that's that.
Thank you. I think that's a really good note to end on. Thanks, John, very much for telling me all about what you do. It was really interesting.
No, thanks for having me.